Once upon a time, that's how all great stories begin. And all stories have power. Whether they're a humorous anecdote or a heartfelt reflection or a tale of triumph of overcoming adversity, they impact our lives. They can hurt or heal relationships depending on the motivation for sharing the story. They can unite or divide families, communities, even countries. Stories can impact our life, and they can increase our well-being or cause anxiety, stress, and fear. They can change your view and shift your perspective and influence your life forever. They play a role in how you see the world and what you believe and who you become. Not only that, stories can actually alter the structure of your brain. Now, more on that, I'm going to tell you that later. But first, I want to tell you a story, a true story that happened to me almost 60 years ago, that influenced my life then and continues to impact my life to this very day. So, once upon a time, when I was in 4th grade, I attended St. Lawrence Catholic School, and I had a teacher named Mrs. Mangelli. She was an imposing, grumpy woman with a permanent scowl on her puffy face. She was like the Trunchbull in Matilda, but she wasn't as nice and kind. One day in November of 1966, the second period report cards came out. And that was the day I decided I wanted to drop out of school. I didn't want to be a high school dropout. I wanted to be an elementary school dropout. And I'll tell you why. On the way home, I slipped the report card out of its little envelope, and I opened it up, and I read what Mrs. Mangelli had written. And she said, Bernadette is obviously having trouble with math concepts. She never volunteers to solve problems on the chalkboard in the front of the classroom. And worst of all, when I ask if there are questions, she never raises her hand. Now, I might have been having trouble with math, but I was not having trouble with reading. I read every word, I understood every word, and unfortunately, I embraced every word, and those words became part of my story. I knew I was failing to live up to her expectations. I was stupid. Now, at that time, when I was in 4th grade, my mom was the busy mother of 8 children born in 9.5 years. She used to keep a journal, and it was recorded our ups and downs, our successes, our struggles, our achievements, and our difficulties, with the idea that as adults we'd be able to go back and revisit that shared history. Now, that evening, the report cards came out. I snuck downstairs, and I took a peek at my mom's journal. In it, she had written, report cards came out today. Kathy, straight A's. Jeannie, straight A's. Deddy, still trying. That was me, my nickname, Deddy, growing up. I was still trying. And I read my mom's words, and I knew that I wasn't as good as my sisters, that I wasn't living up to what they were doing, that I was stupid. Mrs. Mangelli was right. That was part of my story. Now, just a few weeks after that report card came out, that stinking, rotten, no good, very bad, rotten report card came out, a miracle occurred. My dad, who worked for the Department of Agriculture, was transferred, and we were moving to a new state, and I was going to go to a new school far away from Mrs. Mangelli forever. Now, fast forward to December 8th of 1966. It was my first day at Belvedere Elementary School. Now, as the principal was walking me to my new classroom, I can remember thinking, I have never been this nervous in my entire life. I was starting at a new school in the middle of the year, not just any school, a public school, and things were going to be so different. There weren't going to be nuns running all around. I wouldn't have to wear a uniform. We wouldn't go to daily mass. Oh my gosh, This was mind-blowing. It was a big deal, and I was nervous. When we got to the classroom, the principal knocked on the door, and the door was opened by another teacher whose name began with an M, Mrs. Marnell. Mrs. Marnell invited me in, and we stood at the front of the classroom just for a few seconds. She said, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm a little nervous." And Mrs. Marnell said, "I think you're going to be okay." "No, wait a minute, let me take that back. I don't think you're going to be okay. I know it. I just have a feeling. I'm going to let you go over there and have a seat at that empty desk, and we'll get our day started." So I went over and I sat down, and she said, "Class, please stand. We're going to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance." And we all did. And then we sat right back down again. And I was like, oh my gosh, we're not going to pray after the Pledge of Allegiance. Another difference. Mrs. Marnell, after we said the Pledge of Allegiance and sat right back down, she said, "Class, I'd like to welcome Bernadette Howard to our class. She's moving here from Upper Darby, which is just outside of Philadelphia. Is there anybody who can tell me what state Philadelphia is in?" And this boy, who I later learned his nickname was Mr. Smarty Pants, raised his hand. Philadelphia is in the state of Pennsylvania. And he was right, but I noticed he failed to stand up when he spoke with a teacher. And I would never forget that. Then Mrs. Marnell turned to me and said, "Bernadette, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your family, how many siblings, and your favorite subject in school?" Well, you know I wasn't going to say math was my favorite subject. And not wanting to make the same mistake that Mr. Smarty Pants made, I stood up to answer her question. And as I stood up, the entire class burst out laughing. And I had no idea why. I was embarrassed. I was mortified. I was scared. And darn it, I felt stupid. And I began crying. Now, Mrs. Marnell in the front of the classroom clapped her hands joyfully and walked over and said, "I want to thank you, Bernadette. Class, I think we should all thank Bernadette. She just gave me this great idea. Wait till I tell you. Hey, from now on," I mean, I know she's going to learn from us, but we can learn from her too. "From now on, when I call on you, you stand up. You will be the star of the show. Our classroom will be the stage, and we will be your audience. You can shine on the stage every time you stand up to answer a question." Now, Mrs. Marnell, she said to the class that I had something to offer that made me feel valued and hopeful, but best of all, I no longer felt stupid. Now, I revisit this story often as sort of a meditation on gratitude. After just 1 week in my new school, I felt like my old self. Gone was the self-loathing and the self-doubt. Like a seed that isn't watered, the seed of self-doubt that Mrs. Mangelli planted in me withered and died. And in its place, Mrs. Marnell's seed of hope sprouted and thrived under her nurturing care. By the end of 4th grade, I no longer wanted to be a high school or elementary school dropout. I wanted to be a teacher, just like Mrs. Marnell. Now, earlier I mentioned that stories can change the structure of the brain. And thanks to a neurophysiology, we know that every time we learn something new, the brain creates new neural pathways to process that information and to integrate it into the rest of our lives. But when we repeat negative self-stories over and over and over again, like I did when I was in 4th grade, we don't create new neural pathways. We actually strengthen those existing pathways. They become like a road, like a superhighway with no exit ramps and no speed limits. And those negative thoughts can just go zipping on down with nothing to stop them. Fortunately, we also know, due to the science of neuroplasticity, which is how the study of how the brain rewires itself, we know that the brain can do just that. It can create new, varied, more productive and healthy pathways by doing a couple things. by first of all, letting go of those negative self-stories. Find somebody you trust, share your story, and listen to their perspective, and then say farewell to that story. But you also have to create new neuronal pathways, new neural pathways to replace those old ones. And we can do that according to Annie Wright, who is a licensed psychotherapist and an expert in explaining neuroplasticity. She says the brain can change up until the day we die if we learn new skills, memorize new information, and provide ourselves with new experiences. So the question is, what did Mrs. Marnell do for me to help me to have such an impact on her life? And is it possible for us to do that for others? The answer is yes, we can do that for others, but it requires three things. It requires empathy, understanding, and compassion. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about each of those things. Empathy is an emotional response that aligns our feelings with those of another person. It makes that person feel seen and heard and valued. Empathy is a gift that the listener bestows on the person who's speaking. But the person listening with empathy is also rewarded. When we listen with empathy and when we are listened to with empathy, something happens in our bodies. They release serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. And these chemicals come together to bathe the nervous system. They decrease inflammation in the body. They lower your blood pressure. They create feelings of connectedness and a sense of belonging. They enhance the mood. They light up the reward center of the brain and bring a sense of overall feeling of togetherness and belonging. Now, when we do this, who knew that when we listen to somebody, even just for a little bit of time, you listen to somebody's story, you take the time to be curious, you do that for them, you walk in their shoes just for a second, that you could actually have a little hit of pleasure and improve your physical health at the same time. That's what empathy does for us. Now, understanding is a little bit different. Understanding is an intellectual response. It's actually processed in a different part of the brain. It is an appreciation for, not an agreement with somebody else's beliefs and thoughts. It allows people to have meaningful connections despite differences. It's sort of like holding space for somebody while appreciating the common ground, even if you don't agree on everything. And when you have empathy and understanding at the same time, those two things come together and they are a precursor for compassion. Compassion is the decision to take action for the good of another without seeking any recognition or reward for yourself. Mrs. Marnell, back to Mrs. Marnell, she had empathy for my pain and embarrassment. She saw me standing there crying. She understood her role as a professional teacher, as an educator, to make a new student feel welcomed who was struggling. And she acted with an abundance of compassion. I would say crazy, creative compassion, because she acted in a way that not only comforted me, but she did it in a way that she didn't embarrass and shame the other students who had laughed at me. In fact, every student in that class felt energized and connected. They felt the empathy and the compassion. We were together in this story. We belonged as a class to the lucky group of fourth graders who got to stand up and pretend they were on the stage every time they raised their hand to answer a question. Now, this is just an aside, but I do want to mention this. When I was in 8th grade, I went to my first boy-girl party, and I kissed a boy for the first time. His name was David Marnell. But I want to tell you, I didn't kiss David because I liked him. I kissed David because I loved his mother for restoring my confidence in 4th grade. I know, right? So, at a very informative time in my life, Mrs. Marnell taught me about empathy and understanding and compassion. And I later learned so much more about it when I was a mother, when I would sit with my children and we would watch somebody, I'm sure you all know, Mr. Fred Rogers in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I believe Fred Rogers, probably more than anybody else, understood the healing power of stories. Fred Rogers transformed children's television by modeling those qualities every stinking day on every single show. Mr. Rogers said, frankly, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story. And I believe that's true. In my role as a wife, a mother, as a daughter, and as a sister, I ask others to provide information, advice, and guidance and suggestions to me all the time, because I know I don't have all the answers and I'm better with their help and support. But what I really like to hear most, what I really want to hear, are their stories. I learn from their stories. I'm challenged by them. I am inspired by them. When we truly listen to somebody with real empathy, we are changed by them. I implore you to let go of the stories that no longer serve you. Find somebody you can share those stories with, get that perspective, and then say farewell forever. I encourage you, through stories, to connect with others, especially with people who are different from you. Be curious about their life, show genuine interest, ask questions about what's going on with them, and then listen with empathy. Empathy increases understanding. Understanding and empathy together lead to compassion. I believe that the connections made through stories have the power to heal our world and can mobilize humankind for the common good. I hope I'm right, and I hope you will join me in improving the world a little bit more every day, one story at a time. Thank you.